This section is routines. This is the sign for bath. Now practice the sign for bath. This is the sign for breakfast. Now practice the sign for breakfast. This is the sign for lunch. Now practice the sign for lunch. This is the sign for dinner. Now practice the sign for dinner. This is the sign for no. Now practice the sign for no. This is the sign for please. Now practice the sign for please. This is the sign for thank you. Now practice the sign for thank you. This is the sign for yes. Now practice the sign for yes.
This section is about words about time. This is the sign for after. Now practice the sign for after. This is the sign for before. Now practice the sign for before. This is the sign for day. Now practice the sign for day. This is the sign for every day. Now practice the sign for every day. This is the sign for every night. Now practice the sign for every night. This is the sign for later. Now practice the sign for later. This is the sign for morning. Now practice the sign for morning. This is the sign for night. Now practice the sign for night. This is the sign for today. Now practice the sign for today. This is the sign for tomorrow. Now practice the sign for tomorrow. This is the sign for yesterday. Now practice the sign for yesterday.
This section is question words. This is the sign for how. Now practice the sign for how. This is the sign for what. Now practice the sign for what. This is the sign for when. Now practice the sign for when. This is the sign for where. Now practice the sign for where. This is the sign for which. Now practice the sign for which. This is the sign for who. Now practice the sign for who. This is the sign for why. Now practice the sign for why.
This section is prepositions and locations. This is the sign for about. Now practice the sign for about. This is the sign for above. Now practice the sign for above. This is the sign for around. Now practice the sign for around. This is the sign for behind. Now practice the sign for behind. This is the sign for. Now practice the sign for. This is the sign for here. Now practice the sign for here. This is the sign for inside. Now practice the sign for inside. This is the sign for next to. Now practice the sign for next to. This is the sign for on. Now practice the sign for on. This is the sign for out. Now practice the sign for out. This is the sign for over. Now practice the sign for over. This is the sign for to. Now practice the sign for to. This is the sign for under. Now practice the sign for under. This is the sign for with. Now practice the sign for with.